Hi, Soul Traveler. Before we dive into today's intriguing topic, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating explorations into history and culture. Have you ever wondered why the Church, a bastion of faith and doctrine, regarded vampires as one of its greatest threats? The tales of blood-sucking creatures have haunted humanity for centuries, but it was the Church's response to these legends that truly shaped perceptions of them. To understand the depth of this fear, we must journey back through time, exploring the beliefs, legends, and records that transformed the vampire from mere folklore into a formidable enemy of the Church. The roots of the Church's fear of vampires can be traced back to the early medieval period, when Christianity was establishing its dominance across Europe. This was a time rife with superstition, where the boundaries between the spiritual and the corporeal were often blurred. The Church, striving to consolidate its power, viewed any supernatural entity that threatened its control over the populace as a serious concern. Vampires, with their ability to rise from the dead and haunt the living, represented a direct challenge to the Church's teachings on life, death, and the afterlife. One of the earliest recorded instances of vampire lore comes from Eastern Europe, particularly in regions like Transylvania. The infamous figure of Vlad the Impaler, who ruled in the 15th century, became a central figure in vampire mythology. His brutal methods of punishment and penchant for bloodshed led to tales of his resurrection as a vampire, feeding on the blood of his enemies. The Church capitalized on these stories, using them to instill fear and reinforce its own power. They portrayed vampires not just as monsters, but as manifestations of moral decay and rebellion against divine order. As the Church's influence grew, so too did the tales of vampiric entities. In the 18th century, the rise of the Enlightenment brought about a wave of skepticism regarding traditional beliefs. Yet, the vampire mythos continued to thrive. Reports of vampire sightings and attacks were common, with townspeople often citing the Church's teachings to explain these occurrences. The Church found itself in a precarious position. It needed to combat the growing skepticism while simultaneously addressing the fear that vampires instilled in the hearts of the faithful. The legends surrounding vampires were not merely tales of horror. They were steeped in theological significance. Vampires were often depicted as the antithesis of Christ, embodying sin, temptation, and eternal damnation. The act of drinking blood became a grotesque parody of the Eucharist, the sacred ritual of communion in which believers consume the body and blood of Christ. This parallel made vampires seem even more threatening, as they subverted the very foundation of Christian belief. The Church's vampire warrior priests, as the legends suggest, emerged as defenders against these abominations, tasked with rooting out vampiric threats and restoring spiritual order. Interestingly, the vampire panic in Europe during the 18th century led to a series of public trials and executions. In some cases, corpses were exhumed, and rituals were performed to ensure that the deceased could not rise again. These actions were often sanctioned by local clergy, demonstrating how deeply embedded the fear of vampires was within the Church's hierarchy. It was a time when the Church felt that it had to take a proactive stance against what it perceived as a rising tide of supernatural malevolence. In literature, the vampire mythos continued to evolve, with works like John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819 and Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, further embedding these creatures into the cultural consciousness. These texts not only reflected societal fears, but also served to amplify the Church's anxieties. Stoker's Dracula, for instance, is portrayed as a charismatic yet sinister figure, representing the allure of evil that can lead even the most devout astray. The Church's fear of losing souls to such temptations became a palpable concern, as narratives around vampires began to intertwine with moral lessons about faith and salvation. The Church's battle against the vampire mythos also mirrored its struggle against other perceived threats, including witchcraft and heresy. Just as witches were seen as agents of the devil, vampires were viewed as undead beings that had rejected the sanctity of life. This connection allowed the Church to frame its fight against vampires as part of a larger spiritual warfare, positioning itself as the defender of the faithful against all forms of evil. As the 19th century progressed, the vampire became a symbol of the exotic and the unknown. The Church's fear was not just of the creature itself, but of what it represented, a challenge to established norms and an unsettling reminder of humanity's darker impulses. The vampire's ability to seduce and corrupt became a metaphor for the dangers of straying from the path of righteousness. This perception of vampires as embodiments of sin and temptation solidified their status as one of the Church's greatest threats. The vampire legends also intersected with societal fears regarding sexuality and the unknown. The act of a vampire draining blood became a symbol of sexual predation, further complicating the Church's response. As a patriarchal institution, the Church often sought to control narratives around sexuality, and vampires became a potent symbol of that which was uncontainable and dangerous. The allure of the vampire, with their promise of immortality and forbidden desires, posed a risk to the Church's teachings on chastity and morality. As we delve deeper into the 20th century, the vampire's role began to shift yet again, influenced by the rise of cinema and popular culture. Films began to depict vampires in more complex ways, often blurring the lines between good and evil. Yet, even in these modern interpretations, the Church's historical fear of vampires looms large. The lingering belief that vampires represent a challenge to spiritual authority and moral integrity continues to resonate within the narratives we consume today. Ultimately, the Church's fear of vampires was rooted in a struggle for power, control, and the preservation of faith. Vampires, with their seductive nature and challenge to the afterlife, became emblematic of everything the Church sought to combat. They were not merely mythical creatures, but rather reflections of humanity's deepest fears and desires, encapsulating the eternal battle between good and evil. As we navigate the complex tapestry of history, we see that the vampire mythos serves as both a cautionary tale and a mirror to our own vulnerabilities. The Church's response to these legends reveals much about its own insecurities and the societal dynamics of the time. If you enjoyed this exploration into the Church's fear of vampires and the legends that surrounded them, be sure to like and comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for our next journey into the shadows of history. What other myths and legends will we uncover together? Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, soul traveler.